Welcome back to the Livingston Parish News Podcast. My name is McHugh David, publisher and editor of the news. Appreciate you joining us for this. We distribute these podcasts to all platforms that supply podcasts. That includes Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and we distribute via Anchor FM, so you can find it there as well. If you're just interested in listening to this, you don't really want any other podcasts, we do put these on our website, www.livingstonparishnewscom.com/podcast. You can find them there. They are free. We have audio and video versions that you can listen to or watch at your viewing pleasure. We also put them on our YouTube channel. Appreciate you checking us out on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and the aforementioned YouTube. Giving us a like and share there. We need all the support we can get from the community. Today we're going to be talking about the 4 constitutional amendments that are on your ballot for October 12th. We wanted to get all this information out before early voting. Please remember that on October 12th, which is the election day, LSU is playing the University of Florida at 2:30 on CBS. So you're probably going to want to get out there early, and you're probably going to have to stay late. Remember that polls close on 8 p.m. that day. It is also the Saturday of Fair Week. So why worry about the election that day when you can just look at the results later? Go ahead and vote early. Early voting starts September 28th, runs through the next Saturday, but please remember it will not be open on Sunday. So you can vote at 2 sites, at the Walker Denham Library or at the Registrar of Voters office in Livingston. Both locations will be open from 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. All of those days they are open except that Sunday. Please remember that. So this is our Thursday edition of September 12th of the Livingston Parish News. In it, we give you all the information you can stomach about the 4 amendments that are on your ballot. The story is also online, www.livingstonparishnews.com/news. It is called Changing Language, and it's talking about the 4 amendments. It's $5 a month online if you're not interested in picking up a copy of the paper. If you do want a copy of the paper, it is $2. So, since 1995, 185 amendments have made it to the ballot. 75% of them have been approved. Now, that is a trend that has changed over the last few years, but in those early years, a lot of them did get passed, even on fall ballots. There has not been a constitutional convention since 1973. There is a decided push for that because right now over 80% of the state's revenue is locked up in law. It's law that it has to be spent on certain things. Constitutional mandates is what they call them. And so there are a lot of proponents on unlocking as much money as they can, because right now the only things that can take cuts are public health care and higher education, or at least those are the big players that can take the cuts on a yearly basis. So we'll be interesting to see if a constitutional convention moves forward. It will have to be voted on by the legislature. Then they appoint delegates to represent them at a convention. Now, the last one that occurred was in 1973. It was deemed unsuccessful or a devout failure. And so there are people who are still alive who believe that, well, it'll just be a failure again, so why do it? There is a push for it. All of the aspiring representatives and senators running for the state level seats currently that will also be on your ballot on October 12th are in support of a constitutional convention in one way, shape, or form. A lot of them are most interested in getting the people's feelings about it, so trying to make sure that they appoint the appropriate delegates. Now, we had recorded this podcast before. Based on information that we had received, we believe that you would not be voting on the First Amendment we'll discuss, but you will in fact be voting on it. It is an amendment to exempt certain properties from property tax in Orleans Parish. Now, that's 194 mills is currently what is levied on property in Orleans Parish. This is for home sites that are 15 residential units or less, so small condo and apartment buildings could be exempted. Now, it will be up to their local government to decide who is exempted and who is not. I will go ahead and read it to you. Do you support an amendment to allow the city of New Orleans to exempt property within Orleans Parish from all or part of ad valorem taxes that would otherwise be due for the purpose of promoting affordable housing? Again, we thought you wouldn't be voting on it. That is in fact false. You will. So you will vote on that. Again, it's 194.9 mils is what's levied on property in Orleans Parish. They're trying to find a way to make property in that area more affordable. So you'll be that will be on the ballot, and that is number one. Number two, let's read it out loud. This is the Louisiana Property Tax Exemption for Stored Materials Routed for Outer Continental Shelf Amendment. What a name. Do you support an amendment to exempt raw materials, goods, commodities, personal property, and other articles stored in public and private warehouses and destined for the Outer Continental Shelf from ad valorem taxes? Now, what is this? You might be wondering. First, let's cover what the Outer Continental Shelf is. That's where oil rigs are. It's the space about 3 miles off the coast. It's still on the continental shelf, so while there is a ton of water underneath it, it's not quite deep water like we've seen before if you get farther out in the Gulf. And the interesting thing about this is suddenly a lot of these companies who were sending goods and materials and equipment back to the mainland to be maintained, repaired, or stored were suddenly being targeted for what is called inventory tax. Anyone who is in industry, and especially car dealerships, will tell you that inventory tax is sort of an addition to your property taxes. And they take a look at what raw goods and materials that you have on site, and then you're charged a certain property tax rate for them. That's why you see two big sales around July 4th and around Christmas at car dealerships, because depending on who they're dealing with property taxes, they are trying to unload as many vehicles as they can, so they don't have to pay for that. When we used to print the paper here at the News, we'd have to pay for our ink, our paper, and those sorts of things that were sitting on site. So as it stood up until recently, when local governments had discovered they could do this was never a thing. Now, it should be noted that under current law, anything that is being shipped out of the country in these same circumstances, which is being stored in a warehouse, both either private or public, that is owned by these companies or owned by a local government, are not subject to these inventory property taxes. So there's a couple of things going on here. Like I said, it has not happened up until this point, as well as the fact that anything going international is not subject to these taxes. So we'll be interested to see how people vote on that. Please remember that up until recently, they were not paying it. The next one will be interesting here in Livingston Parish because it deals directly with education. I'll read it to you. It is called the Louisiana Education Excellence Fund. Mouthful, EEF, the Louisiana Education Excellence Fund Uses Amendment. Do you support an amendment to provide for appropriations from the Education Excellence Fund for the Louisiana Educational Television Authority, LETA, Thrive Academy, and laboratory schools operated by public post-secondary education institutions? Now, what's interesting about this is the Education Excellence Fund receives its revenue from the Millennium Fund, which is the tobacco settlement from the late 1990s. Much like the settlement from BP, where BP makes payments, the tobacco fund, the Big Tobacco, makes payments to the state of Louisiana, which go into this fund. Now, LETA is the Louisiana Educational Television Authority. Thrive Academy is a boarding school in Baton Rouge, and the lab schools are just that. U-High is a lab school for LSU. Southern Lab is a lab school for Southern. And Benjamin Franklin, which is more often than not at the top of the rankings for Louisiana in terms of high schools, is a lab school for UNO. So those are the kind of schools that are looking for a piece of this pie. Right now, LETA is looking for $75,000 a year. The Thrive Academy is looking for $75,000 as well as a per pupil allocation. And the lab schools are looking for block grants based on a per pupil metric. Now, what's interesting is this money is already going to public schools, specialty schools, which include the Louisiana School for the Deaf, charter schools, as well as approved private schools, which could be something like Episcopal, as well as diocese schools, which is something like Catholic High, which is based on the Catholic Church. Now, these funds cannot be used for your normal day-to-day operations, and they cannot be used, for anything, say, in a public school that is already being funded and a revenue stream is dedicated from a local tax or the Minimum Foundation Program MFP funding. What they can be used for are things of this nature. excuse me, early childhood education programs focused on enhancing the preparation of at-risk children. So at-risk children are people with learning disabilities or issues at home that need to be targeted early to try to make sure that they get in school and stay in school. So that's one of the uses. Remedial instruction and assistance to children who fail to achieve the required scores on any tests, of which passage is required pursuant to state law for advancement to a succeeding grade. As we know, there are a lot of I can't remember the name. There are a lot of tests out there now, a lot of standardized tests. There it is, that are going into these schools, especially after the implementation of Common Core, causing a lot of anxiety in schools. This money would be used to fund tutoring so that these students would be able to find a way to help bridge that gap between the grade they needed to pass and go to another course in the grade that they got. A lot of these standardized tests come up in late elementary and in junior high. There is still some testing in high school, but it's not as important as, of course, they start getting into the SAT and ACT at that point. The last thing is other education programs approved by the legislature, such as administration, extended instruction, which is tutoring, instructional technology and personnel certification, and professional development, preschool instruction, and school accountability and improvement. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we have a lot of vocational instruction that has been growing in Livingston Parish, and that is covered under those deals. Now, it'd be interesting to see if we receive EEF funds already for such things or not. My guess would be probably, because the central office for the school board is very good about finding revenue for these new programs. But these are the things, this money is what those types of schools are after. And you already have most of the subset of schools in Louisiana that receive it. So it will be interesting to see how voters react at the polls. Remember that we do not have any of those other types of schools here in Livingston Parish. We are reliant heavily on the public school system, which is also the largest real estate holder in terms of value. Weyerhaeuser has the most land, but if you include the improvements to the land, which are those schools, Livingston Parish School Board is the largest real estate holder in Livingston Parish, also the largest employer, because we got to have teachers. So please remember, 4 amendments, we'll read them to you shortly. All of your aspiring, excuse me, wait, I'm forgetting one. We got 4, and we got one more. And this one's a doozy, so please pay attention, because this one's crazy. So let me read it to you first. The Louisiana Board of Tax Appeals Jurisdiction Amendment. So, do you support an amendment to protect taxpayers by requiring a complete remedy in law for the prompt recovery of any unconstitutional tax paid, to allow the jurisdiction of the Board of Tax Appeals to extend to matters related to the constitutionality of taxes? So let's back up. Okay, so what this means is that if you ever find a tax, a fee, or a claim against the state to be unconstitutional, or it's not being paid in a prompt manner, or you just want to bring it up to somebody, you would normally go to the Board of Tax Appeals. Their job is to look at your situation, apply a process, and if they deem you worthy of the next step, you go to court, state level court. That's how it happens now. Then it usually gets tied up in court. If you win in court, after waiting forever because state level courts are bogged down at the moment, it then has to be approved by the legislature and added to the budget. What this would change in that process is this: allow the legislature through a 2/3 vote to give the Louisiana Board of Tax Appeals jurisdiction over the constitutionality of taxes. So that's step 1. Even if this amendment passes, the legislature would still have to vote to implement these new rulings. Required prompt recovery by taxpayers of any unconstitutional tax paid. Establish authority for the board in the state constitution subject to changes made by laws passed by 2/3 vote in the legislature. So anything that passes through the legislature would immediately be assumed and implemented by the Board of Tax Appeals with regard to taxation, fees, and claims against the state. Finally, this is the clarifying point: state in the Constitution that the Louisiana Board of Tax Appeals has jurisdiction over any disputes concerning state and local taxes, fees, or other claims against the state. Now, you'll hear a lot of people talk about, what's the difference between a fee and a tax? Well, the answer is not much, especially if it's provided by a government. The interesting thing recently is that in Districts 2 and 3, they tried to pass a fee to supply mosquito abatement. Now, that failed, but it would have been interesting to see how it would have gone after this was implemented. Somebody from those areas could have gone to the Board of Tax Appeals if this had not passed, or in the spring after that vote occurred, if it had passed, they could have gone to the Board of Tax Appeals and said this is unconstitutional. They then would have been put into the meat grinder of the process. If this passes and then the legislature ratifies it, what could happen then is, instead of being put into the meat grinder of the process and then shipped off the court, the Board of Tax Appeals could rubber stamp payment right then and there. Very interesting how this will play out in the future. It will be interested to see how the board is made up, who is on the board, and what they do. But for right now, this would apply to taxes, fees, and claims against the state. Right now, all of those are very difficult processes to go through. So please keep an eye on the language in these amendments. We're going to read all four to you again, and then we're going to talk about the Constitutional Convention one more time. So, number 1 is the New Orleans Affordable Housing Property Tax Exemption Amendment. Do you support an amendment to allow the city of New Orleans to exempt property within Orleans Parish from all or part of ad valorem taxes that would otherwise be due for the purpose of promoting affordable housing? Number 2, do you support an amendment to exempt raw materials, goods, commodities, personal property, and other articles stored in public and private warehouses and destined for outer continental shelf from ad valorem taxes? That is the Louisiana property tax exemption for stored materials routed for the outer continental shelf amendment. The Louisiana Education Excellence Fund Uses Amendment. Do you support an amendment to provide for appropriations from the Educational Excellence Fund for the Louisiana Educational Television Authority, Thrive Academy, and Laboratory Schools operated by public post-secondary education institutions? And last, but certainly not least, the one we just spent a while talking about, the Louisiana Board of Tax Appeals Jurisdiction Amendment. Do you support an amendment to protect taxpayers by requiring a complete remedy in law for the prompt recovery of any unconstitutional tax paid, and to allow the jurisdiction of the Board of Tax Appeals to extend to matters related to the constitutionality of taxes? So those are your 4. You will be voting on all 4 of them because they are constitutional amendments, so they will apply to the statewide constitution, even though that one amendment only affects Orleans Parish and their ability to designate that. Remember that all of your aspiring state-level legislators are interested in a constitutional convention. The last one was 1973. That was deemed a failure because they just re-tied up all that money. Currently, 80% of the state's budget is tied up in constitutional mandates on how the money must be spent, which is why you always see talks of cuts to higher education and public health care, because that's the only place they can cut. So please pay attention to the language on your ballots. This will be on your October 12th ballot. If you're looking to early vote, that begins September 28th. It's a Saturday. It is at the Denham Springs Walker branch of the library. It is also at the Registrar of Voters office in Livingston. And they open from 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. in the evening. Not open on that Sunday during the week. They're open from Saturday to Saturday. Please remember that October 12th, LSU plays Florida at 2:30 on CBS. It is also the Saturday of Fair Week. So try to get your early voting out of the way. Again, you can go to the Denham Walker Branch Library, or you may go to the Registrar of Voters office. Again, we appreciate you joining us for this podcast talking about the amendments. If you're looking to if you want to read all about them, this is our September 12th edition. You can come to our office and buy a copy. They are $2. You can also check out the story online, www.livingstonparishnews.com/news. It's called Changing Language. Our website is $5 a month for access, but you can get all this information there. We appreciate you joining us. My name is McHugh David, publisher and editor of the news. We're going to be coming at you with another podcast this week on FEMA, and we will be talking next week about the election as a whole. Check you next time. Thanks for joining us.